China is the one that made Apple, and Apple is the one that made China. I know this sounds like a big statement, maybe even an exaggeration, maybe even untrue. But before we begin, let me remind you of just one fact that might make this statement more acceptable. Remember 2 or 3 years ago when US President Joe Biden passed the CHIPS Act? A law that provided support for the semiconductor industry, $52 billion over 4 years. That support was spread across a large number of companies and was considered a historic achievement, an effort to strengthen American manufacturing and bring supply chains back home. Biden himself described that investment as something that happens once in a generation. $52 billion, framed in those terms. Now, leave America aside for a moment and look at what Apple spent in China in 2015 alone. $55 billion in a single year. That money went into infrastructure, training, and supply chains. A massive number, especially considering it came from one single company in a country like China. So, is the idea that Apple made China only about money? Not exactly, I explain it. But I want you to get the bigger idea that today, China could probably survive without Apple, but Apple would collapse if its relationship with China ended. So how did this happen? That's what we'll discover in today's episode. Back in March 1996, the giant company we know today as Apple was bleeding money and on the verge of bankruptcy. Joe O'Sullivan, the vice president of the company at the time, recalled how one night he found himself in extremely tough negotiations to sell Apple's last major factory in the United States. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, he received a terrifying phone call from his boss. The message was blunt. If the deal wasn't closed that day, no one at Apple would be paid their salary at the end of the week. That was the shocking moment O'Sullivan realized that Apple's cash reserves had completely dried up, and the company had entered its death spiral. Keep in mind, this was before Steve Jobs returned to Apple. At that point, the company was losing around $1 billion a year and laying off thousands of employees. O'Sullivan had no other choice but to sell the factory in a desperate attempt to save the company. But that sale wasn't just about offloading an asset. It marked the moment Apple decided to abandon manufacturing its own products and instead throw itself into the arms of foreign manufacturers. From then on, Apple shifted from a strategy of building its own products to one of outsourcing assembly. Production first went to companies in South Korea and Taiwan, then to factories in Mexico and Wales. Eventually, though, the most important destination became China. At that time, China wasn't seen as an ideal place for advanced technological manufacturing. Everything about it suggested otherwise. But 2 things happened at once that changed the story. The first was the Chinese government's strong support for Apple. The second was the presence of a man named Terry Gou, the founder of Foxconn. Terry Gou wasn't focused on making big profits from Apple at the start. What he really wanted was knowledge. He wanted Apple to train his workers and engineers in China. And Apple did exactly that. Not 100 engineers, not 1,000 workers, not even 10,000. Apple trained 28 million Chinese workers in manufacturing skills. 28 million. That number is mind-blowing. At one point, every year, teams of Apple's smartest engineers would descend like a flock on their suppliers' factories in China, staying there for months. Apple didn't just send catalogs and blueprints and tell suppliers to figure it out. No, Apple's engineers worked side by side with Chinese workers on the production line, showing them how to build things from scratch. Even today, Apple directly and indirectly supports more than 5 million jobs in China. So the 28 million figure isn't far-fetched. This training built a massive army of technicians and engineers, graduates of Apple's own internal schools, who went on to form the backbone of China's industrial and technological rise. They didn't just serve Apple's products anymore, they became the foundation of China's entire tech ecosystem. And Gou was clever. He constantly rotated his workers and engineers. When Apple engineers trained one batch of workers, those workers were quietly moved to other production lines to make different products, while new workers replaced them on the Apple line. Over time, Apple ended up training everyone. In short, Apple didn't just teach the Chinese how to catch a fish. It taught them how to fish, gave them the rod and the net, and stocked the entire pond. Apple invested hundreds of millions, then billions of dollars in buying the latest cutting-edge manufacturing machines and placing them inside Foxconn and later Pegatron factories, teaching them how to operate them. In effect, China got a world-class education in advanced manufacturing for free. But Apple wasn't doing this out of generosity. In exchange, it gained cheap prices and absolute control. Once a supplier learned everything and became completely dependent on Apple, Apple would start squeezing them. The contracts were brutal, prices so low that no sane supplier would normally accept them. Sometimes, the contracts even caused suppliers to operate at a loss. Take Foxconn for example. Its profit margin dropped from 10.6% in 2000 to just 2.4% by 2011, once it became deeply tied to Apple. Meanwhile, Apple's own profit margin skyrocketed. And Apple put all the risk on its suppliers. For instance, if an iPhone was returned under warranty within a year, Foxconn had to repair or replace it at its own cost, without Apple even explaining what the defect was. This forced Foxconn to maintain extraordinary quality standards to avoid financial losses. So the deal was clear. Apple gave Chinese suppliers the knowledge, technology, and orders that made them #1 in the world. In return, they had to work almost for free and shoulder all the risks. Now, you might say, what's the point of being Apple's supplier if you're not making money? The answer, while they may have lost money with Apple, the knowledge they gained allowed them to win contracts with other companies, clients who wanted to work with the supplier that built Apple's products. This arrangement allowed Apple to build, within just a few years, the most advanced and profitable supply chain on the planet. To give you an idea, in 2005, thanks to Chinese factories, Apple sold 22.5 million iPods in a single year, up from less than 1 million in 2003. That kind of leap would have been impossible without Foxconn's ability to assemble products at such massive scale and speed. Now you might be thinking, wait a second, Foxconn is a Taiwanese company. They just set up factories in China to take advantage of cheap labor. Where was the Chinese government in all this? The truth is, the Chinese government welcomed these investments with open arms. They made everything easy for Apple and Foxconn to ensure the manufacturing process went smoothly. But at the same time, Beijing had a completely different goal in mind. Well, China has a strategy of deliberately inviting the world's strongest competitors into its domestic market, letting them operate freely, even encouraging them. The idea is that local companies will be forced to compete with the best, learn from them, and eventually outgrow them. If they can beat the strongest player in China's massive market, then they're ready to compete globally. We saw this strategy play out later with Tesla. But before Tesla, it was Apple. And this approach even has a nickname in China, the catfish effect. The story goes back to old fishermen who caught sardines. Their biggest problem was that the fish would die on the long journey to market, arriving stale. No matter what they tried, nothing worked. Until someone came up with a clever trick. They put a single catfish into the tank with the sardines. Because the catfish constantly chased the sardines stayed alert and kept moving the whole trip, arriving alive and fresh. Yeah, that's exactly how China used Apple. Apple wasn't just a foreign manufacturer. It was the catfish meant to stir up the local electronics industry, keeping it active and forcing it to grow stronger. Out of this environment came Chinese giants like Huawei and Xiaomi, who today dominate not only in China, but around the world. By 2012, this strategy was paying off massively. Apple's revenues in China jumped from less than $1 billion in 2008 to $23 billion in 2012. At the same time, China had become the second largest market for Apple in the world. Apple thought it was in control of China, but then the tables began to turn. After Xi Jinping came to power in 2013, China shifted into show of strength mode. The days of being the world's cheap factory were over. China had already learned everything it needed. Now it was time to control the relationship with Apple. And Beijing moved fast. In 2013, Chinese state media launched coordinated campaigns against Apple, accusing it of arrogance, mistreating workers, and giving Chinese consumers worse warranty policies than Americans. The message was clear. In China, we set the rules, not you. Your success here is a privilege we allow you, and we can take it away at any time. At first, Apple ignored the attacks, confident that its policies were the same everywhere. But as the pressure grew, as newspapers, television, and public opinion turned against the company, it became impossible to ignore. For the first time, Apple realized this was not a business dispute. It was political. Tim Cook himself had to step in. In an unprecedented move, he wrote a long public apology letter in Chinese and published it on Apple's local website. But the real turning point came in 2016. According to leaks later reported, Tim Cook made a secret trip to Beijing, where Apple signed a memorandum of understanding with the Chinese government. In it, Apple promised to invest a staggering $275 billion in China over the next 5 years. The company pledged to help Chinese firms build advanced technologies, to invest more in worker training, to buy more components from Chinese suppliers, to cooperate with Chinese universities, and even to invest in Chinese tech startups. To show goodwill, Apple also announced a $1 billion cash investment in Didi, the Chinese ride-hailing company known as the Uber of China. On the surface, this seemed unrelated to Apple's business, but analysts suggested it was more of a goodwill payment, a way to please powerful people in Beijing. After all, the founder of Didi came from one of the most politically connected families in China, tied directly to Lenovo's empire and the upper levels of government. So, why was Apple forced into this position? Why didn't it just leave China and replicate the model somewhere else, say in India, Vietnam, or even back in the US? That might have worked in the past, but today the situation is completely different. China is no longer just a country with millions of trained workers. It's a country that took the head start Apple gave it, built its own technological base, and in some areas even surpassed the very company that once taught it. Take Huawei, for example. If it weren't for the US sanctions in 2019, Huawei might have already overtaken Apple in several fields. And beyond that, the supply chain Apple created in China is nearly impossible to replicate quickly anywhere else. It's not impossible, but it would be enormously difficult and expensive. Here's the reality. Around 90% of Apple's products are manufactured in China. Out of 200 of Apple's top suppliers, 150 are based in China. Even the small share of production that Apple has shifted to India and Vietnam still relies heavily on Chinese components. As industry experts often say, when it comes to Apple, all roads lead back to China. And what if Apple tried to move everything back to the United States? Well, one estimate showed that if the iPhone were manufactured entirely in America, its retail price could soar to around $3,500, triple its current price. That's simply not viable. So, Apple is stuck. On the one hand, it's America's crown jewel, a $3 trillion company, an icon of American innovation, delivering massive profits to US investors. On the other hand, a huge portion of those profits come from China. And here lies the real danger. America can no longer tolerate having one of its greatest companies so deeply dependent on its biggest geopolitical rival. Voices in Congress are increasingly pressuring Apple to reduce its reliance on China in order to protect US national interests. The paradox is striking. The same China that once powered Apple's meteoric rise is now its greatest threat. And the danger doesn't come only from China's side, but from America as well. But tell me, after everything you've just learned about Apple's situation, the pressure from China, the expectations from the US, and the fragile balance in between, what would you do if you were Apple's CEO? What decisions would you make? What precautions would you take? Would you stay in China or start cutting ties before it's too late? I want to know your thoughts. Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep making deep dives like this one.